Exciting always to be talking to you. Today we're going to talk about tent immigration courts that have been going up at the U.S. Mexico border. We're going to talk about why they're going up, what's going on, and just raise some concerns. So thank you for listening in again. Welcome to Nation of Immigrants.
You're listening to Nation of Immigrants.
America is a nation of immigrants.
A podcast about U.S. immigration law with your host, Jacob Tingen.
All right. Well, thank you once again for tuning in. Like I said, this is Nation of Immigrants, and we have actually a growing subscriber list on YouTube, and more people are listening on iTunes. So I just want to say thank you for listening. For those who are so inclined, please support the podcast. What we're doing is we're collecting donations at jacobtingen.com. You can visit my podcast page there, and then there's a link to donate. We are setting up a 501c3, and donations to support the podcast we plan to gear towards immigrants' legal bills. So that's an option for you if you hear about some of these issues and you say, hey, I want to support, I want to do something. There is an option for you. Okay, so tent immigration courts. What's actually happening? What's going on? Why does this matter? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Here's the rundown. So the Trump administration knows that there's a massive court backlog, and you know, it's fine that we want to do things to kind of work through that backlog as quickly and as efficiently as possible. However, it's also important to protect everyone's right to due process in a court of law. That's just kind of the standard for court procedures in a nation like ours, where we believe that things should be fair. And so when people approach our borders and say, hey, I'm afraid to return to my home country, we already have a process, and we've talked about this a bit in the past, where they get a credible fear interview. If they pass, they're then admitted to the country, and they get the opportunity to present a full asylum case in a court of law. Well, with the advent of some of these policies that came out over the summer, the whole Remain in Mexico policy, there's a body of several tens of thousands of immigrants waiting in Mexico for immigration court hearings that are happening in the U.S. And so what the Trump administration has done, they've been, getting some of these immigrants and arranging their court dates, and the immigrants have to then come up to the U.S. border, and they've been going, I believe, either to the San Diego Immigration Court or the El Paso, Texas Immigration Court, and they've literally been picking up these immigrants at the border in official government vehicles, taking them over to the court hearing, and then returning them back to Mexico, because that is very efficient. Obviously, that's why we're doing this. So anyway, that's what's been happening. And, there's a recognition here that there's a lot more that needs to be done if we're going to go through these cases quickly and efficiently. So they've set up tent courts somewhere on the Texas border. And the idea is that immigrants will come to the border, be carted across, taken to their hearing, and then returned back to Mexico. Again, because presumably this is the most efficient way to do this. Instead of course, honoring our international agreements and our notions of due process and fairness, allowing people to have a credible fear interview and be admitted to the U.S. and do it that way. But, this is what we're doing. So, tent immigration courts. Some of the issues, of course, are going to be, just fairness of the proceedings. So if I'm a Remain in Mexico immigrant and I am afraid of returning to my home country in Central America, and I have to wait in Mexico during my hearing, I have a right to an attorney that I pay for by myself, but it's going to be awfully hard for me to find a U.S. immigration attorney while I remain in Mexico. So that's probably one of the biggest concerns that I think should be brought up when we talk about tent immigration courts. But then the second issue you have is that a lot of these immigrants, of course, can't find an attorney. But then if they go to this tent immigration court, and what's interesting is that there hasn't been a lot of information released about what's going on in this, and we'll touch on that in a bit. But if the government attorney is present in the tent with you, and you're an immigrant, and you don't have your attorney present with you, you're at a distinct disadvantage in these court proceedings. Now, I'm under the impression that you're pretty much in the tent alone, that you're appearing by video teleconference. That's my understanding, is that people are brought into these tents and then they teleconference to an immigration court somewhere else and talk to a judge through a TV. And my assumption is that a government attorney is in the courtroom with the judge. And my assumption is also that if you have an attorney, they're probably in that teleconferenced courtroom with the judge as well. But I'm not sure. And one of the reasons that I'm not sure is, one, I don't practice at the border. I'm in Virginia. But two, there are no observers allowed in the tent courts. So that's something that to me is alarming. Anytime the government doesn't want to let people in or doesn't want to let people see things and not even allow any kind of observation to occur, it raises this idea, well, is there something to hide? Is there a reason that we don't want observers there? Is it perhaps because it would be evident that we're not protecting procedural fairness and due process for immigrants? And so that's the conclusion that I have to draw as an attorney and an advocate for immigrants. That's the conclusion I have to draw, because otherwise there's no reason. If there's nothing to hide, why not let people in? I understand that there are logistical concerns, right? You've got to bring immigrants, the Remain in Mexico immigrants, across the border and into the court in an orderly fashion and have them exit. But, to not allow maybe U.S. present family members in to be part of the proceedings, to not allow attorneys or other kinds of reporters or other observers into the tent courts seems to me like a failure of our standard here in the U.S. of what you would expect of a court process. So that is perhaps one of the biggest reasons that I take issue with it. The other thing is that, it is my sense that a judge is going to give a fairer shake, and this is just anecdotal. I've no evidence to back this up, but I think it makes sense that you're going to get a fairer shake when the judge is present in the courtroom with you. I think it is actually documented that people who are detained have lower approval rates than people who are not detained. People who are detained generally, which means detained means they're in jail. So people in removal proceedings who are in jail for whatever reason typically have lower approval rates. And part of that is probably due to the fact that they appear by TV. They can't be in the courtroom. The judge isn't able to observe and analyze the behavior of that person during testimony or other issues that come up in a court proceeding as well as they might if somebody's there live. And so I just feel that any tent court process where I'm transported across the border and then beamed across the country through a TV probably doesn't quite pass what I would call fairness in these proceedings, especially for these people who aren't detained or aren't in jail for any reason and, have a right to a fair hearing, have a right to an attorney that they pay for by themselves. Well, so I am a little sympathetic because, it is an effort to get rid of the immigration court backlog. We do need more courts. I just imagine that they shouldn't be tent courts. They should be buildings staffed with judges and government attorneys and staff, and that immigrants should be allowed to go to them with their attorney. I just think that there should be more immigration courts. There should be more immigration judges. I'm totally fine with that. But there should also be protections on procedural fairness and due process. So let me just share with you some of the things that I've been reading about that kind of strike me as inappropriate in all of this process. Now, remember, most of the purpose behind these tent courts is because we've got these Remain in Mexico immigrants, which I've read some estimates, about 40,000 people that are currently waiting in Mexico for a U.S. immigration hearing. They're claiming asylum in the U.S. Now, when I have an immigrant client, I absolutely encourage them to attend every single hearing. Now, one of the reasons that that's important is if you don't show up to your hearing, then the judge automatically enters what's known as an in absentia order of removal. In absentia meaning in your absence. Since you didn't show up, you didn't come to defend yourself, I'm just going to go ahead and enter this order of removal. Now, there are reasons that immigrants maybe don't show up to their removal proceedings, ranging from, well, I just didn't go, to, frankly, I didn't hear about it or wasn't aware that it was happening, to what I'm about to tell you about. So one of the news articles that I read indicated that this woman had her scheduled hearing in the San Diego Immigration Court. Approaches the U.S. border where she's told she needs to wait at 7:30 a.m., is asked to wait for an hour by border officials. She's there with a group of other immigrants. She keeps expecting to be transported up to the court so that she can talk to the judge. She has U.S.-based family who have paid for an attorney and hired an attorney, so she's in a pretty decent spot. Unfortunately, the entire morning passes, and she is never permitted to go across and into the immigration court. At one point, the border officials say, okay, well, that's it for the day, and turns them around. Now, upon arriving back at her home, she gets furious and frantic phone calls from family members saying, where were you? The judge entered an in absentia order of removal because you failed to appear for removal proceedings. Okay? So do you see the problem? It's of course, permitted to enter an in absentia order of removal if somebody doesn't show up for an immigration proceeding. However, if they're not even allowed to go at all, that's exceedingly improper and incorrect and does not stand up to our notions of, procedural fairness and due process. Now, this particular immigrant, she had an attorney in the U.S. who was able to kind of reverse that decision. But I imagine that others in her group maybe were not as benefited from counsel as they needed to be to protect their interests. Now, what's interesting is in absentia order of removal. We talked about this with my partners, and some of them laughed and said, well, great, now we're entering orders of removal from a country they've never entered. And so that's the sad state of affairs that we're in. Does this happen with every case? Probably not. Does it happen more than it needs to? It happened this time, so the chances that it's not happening other times, in my view, is relatively low. So this is obviously cause for concern. How are we treating immigrants? Are we giving them due process that is due? And I would posit that with these tent immigration courts, it's just another opportunity for the Trump administration to say, hey, we're trying to eliminate the court backlog, or hey, we like legal immigration, and say, look at all these things we're doing to support legal immigration. But in the end, it's not really supporting anything. As we've seen, Trump administration officials and the John Oliver sketch we talked about the last time have said, yeah, we support legal immigration, but then they turn around and enact policies like the public charge policy that actually limits legal immigration. And so we see that here, legitimate asylum seekers, sure, they should come on in, but we're not even giving people the chance to adequately make an asylum claim at all. And that's troubling. So that's what we're talking about today in Nation of Immigrants. I hope that you understand a little bit better about what's happening with the tent courts, why it's happening, and then some of the problems that may come as a result. We have an existing asylum process where, again, we used to give credible fear interviews and then admit people into the country while they waited on their hearing to occur. And now, given the U.S. Supreme Court decision from last week, Mexico is considered a safe third country for U.S. immigration policies currently. And like I said, there is a court case winding its way through that may change that decision. But that's kind of where we're at. Thank you again for listening. You can always donate and support immigrants by donating to support the podcast at jacobtingen.com. Don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And thank you for listening and for learning more about what immigrants in our nation are going through. I think if you know an immigrant, or you have an immigrant friend, or maybe a family member or a friend who's getting married to an immigrant and is going through this process, you need to understand it's a stressful time for them. Do what you can to support them. Thank you again for listening, and have a good day.
Thank you for listening to Nation of Immigrants.
America is a nation of immigrants.
Subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Watch the live stream on YouTube and Facebook, or visit jacobtingen.com to learn more.